Hey guys, so today you and I are going to talk about REST. So let's get into it. So the question in question was posted on a video that I made about database migrations. And in that video I showcase you how when you're getting a record in a let's just say a transitional a migration strategy rather than just running a batch job, you might actually transition gradually over time when people access records. I'm showing you basically how you can rewrite the record when you're trying to fetch it. So a subscriber writes and asks, Frederick, but since you are mutating a record on a GET request, does that not break the REST principle? And so I write back and I try to explain that the idea behind REST is not that there is a rule for how the shape of a record needs to look in the actual database. What's important is that the record that we are exposing towards the client is a consistent one. In other words, if I have an API specification where I say to you that, well, according to my API, when you access my endpoint, you're going to get say a first name and a last name. It is and as long as I fulfill that contract towards the client, I'm still using a I'm still the client doesn't have to know that in my database, for example, I might have the first name and a last name as just a plain string. It might just be a name property or something like that. That's not for the client to know, and the reason why this is very important to know, like the distinction between a record that you hold in the database versus a record that you're sending towards the client, or a view model, that is also a very popular term. There has to be a difference between these two, because you cannot have them be one and the same in all situations. And the reason is that, let's say that I have some data in my database that I don't want to send to my client. An example would be, let's say that I have a user model. Let's say that there's a password on the user's model where I store it. Well, I can't send the password to any client, because that wouldn't make sense. If you went to your Facebook page with all your followers or friends, imagine if you could just open the network tab and see all their passwords. You're still using REST. You're still connecting to a system where you get the user resource, but the shape of that resource is not dictated necessarily by how Facebook or Google or whoever, right, how they store that data in the database. That's besides the point. As long as they are fulfilling the contract between the client and to the client, you're still doing it right. And so in this video I try to showcase that you can actually just migrate in a very slow fashion. It's not an ideal solution because it can lead to a lot of data inconsistencies, but sometimes it is necessary because you can't run a batch job and just rewrite everything. However, I also have I have another person who points out something that I think is a good learning opportunity for us. So the other person describes that a better way to deal with transitioning in a database in an iterative fashion, instead of just when you read up a record, for example, then immediately mutating it into the right shape and then saving it before returning it to the client, he states it's better to use an event such as user queried that contains the user details in the payload, and then create an event listener and in an async fashion send out that message. By doing this, you make sure that the GET API is only doing one job perfectly, and it should fail for only one reason. A GET API failing for not saving the updated user properly violates the single responsibility principle. The listener can be built and tested independently, and it can have all the possible logic regarding the update. If some exceptions happen in the listener, it's not going to impact the GET query, which is absolutely true. Once all users are migrated, you can remove the listener. Migrations being done in an asynchronous fashion is a better strategy. Now, the reason why I want to touch on this is because this statement has some parts that are true and some parts that are overlooked. And it is the reason why in the solution that I presented in this video, I picked a synchronous operation. Now, if you it is absolutely true what this subscriber is stating. If you have a endpoint where you can get a user and it reads up a record and it rewrites that record and then saves it back to the database before sending it to the client, you are doing two operations. In the absolute strictest definition of the single responsibility principle, you are breaking that principle. Now, however, the alternative is, as this subscriber is saying, that you could do this in an asynchronous fashion. I would like to pose the question though: when do we follow the single responsibility principle? Where is the cut-off point? Where is the exact moment when we go, no, actually, this is breaking that principle? Because if you have a listener, or you have, in this case it's in Node. In other words, if you have a listener that is listening for the event of a read from the database, in this case it's most likely going to happen in the same endpoint controller. Well, technically you are breaking the single responsibility principle, because you still have to dispatch an event, and that event can actually fail. There is an opportunity for that call to fail. The same thing can be said for, say, logging. A logger, like if you log anything in any method at any point, you're doing more than one thing. And so, for me, when we talk about, from my perspective, this person is showcasing an example of when I argue a person is too die-hard on interpreting the words of a principle. The principle is supposed to be a guide. It's supposed to be something that we use to influence our workflow, and its ultimate purpose is actually to keep the code simpler. In other words, you can use the single responsibility argument as a way to measure if your code is doing too much. That doesn't necessarily mean that it strictly has to do exactly one thing. If you think about it, how many of your favorite tools, because one thing would be, you know that the single responsibility principle is actually its heart and soul is most likely the philosophy that you're going to find in the Linux Foundation and practically the entire Linux ecosystem, where we argue that, all right, we are going to make really small programs that are really good at doing just one thing. But depending on our philosophical viewpoint, think about it. Even a simple command such as the cat command has multiple flags, can do more things than just log out the contents of a file. There is practically no tool that you have in your entire toolbox that only does exactly one thing, even though these tools are supposed to be developed with the mindset that they should only do one thing and do that thing really well. So what I want to argue here is that there is a little bit of wiggle room in terms of interpreting something like a principle, such as the dry principle is also one of my favorite ones. What is dry? At what point do we say that now we're actually just misinterpreting the intent behind the principle, and we're becoming almost religiously, we're becoming fundamentalists. We're looking at the literal statement of the principle instead of the intention behind it. An example that I've used many times is that if you ever have a duplicate string anywhere in your entire code, well, that's technically you breaking the dry principle, depending on how you look at it. If you have a single function anywhere where there's shared logic, you're technically breaking the single responsibility, the don't repeat yourself, the dry principle. And you should, right, basically rewrite all that logic into what I like to call template functions, where it's the same function and then you just create a function that takes in all the arguments that are deviations. Now the problem with that is that is a massive anti-pattern, at least if you ask me and the vast majority of people that I know, because now you're actually complicating the code. The dry principle is intended, or any principle is intended, to help us write better software. So but you remember, the principles that was developed by someone who's not in our current situation, so we can't just religiously follow that one single principle. We have to be mature enough, just as when you're following a law in the law book. There's a big difference between interpreting the exact words of a law and understanding its purpose. That's the thing that we should really think about. So what I want you to take away from this is that if you're ever in a situation where you might actually create a worse situation for yourself if you need and you follow that and you create that situation because you want to religiously follow a principle, then you are misunderstanding the principle. The principle is designed to help you write better software, and if that end goal is not met, you need to make a solution that is better. In this scenario, as I wrote back to the subscriber, I said that, well, in the synchronous option, when you're doing a data migration, you can actually make an atomic change. In other words, I can be guaranteed that I will not change the record or overwrite the record anyway, as long as I lock down the record while I'm actually fetching it. In your solution with an asynchronous message being dispatched and then the record being updated later, there's a time window where if you get the record and then the client immediately sends a new record, an updated version of that record, well, what guarantees do you have that your asynchronous message is going to resolve before that message? You might actually have yourself a race condition there where the new record has been injected already, but your solution doesn't know that, so it's going to overwrite that record with the old data. And that is a very real risk with the asynchronous solution. So the idea that you should do this because you don't want to break the single responsibility principle might actually create a bigger problem for you than if you're a bit pragmatic and understand the intention behind the principle. Have a great day.